Howdy folks, I'm Joel Blecher. I'm a professor of history at the Georgetown University. I'm going to be talking to you today about Islam and the spice trade, prophet and prophecy in the global Middle Ages. And the main argument of this whole exercise and of my talk today is really to help you explore and understand not only the way in which Islam was exported as a commodity along the spice trade, along other commodities like pepper and cotton and incense, but also the way in which the spice trade itself was, in a sense, exported by Islam, Islamic norms of trade, ethics, law, and structured by Islamic institutions and Islamic networks. So before we get going, maybe just a few words of logistics of how this whole thing is going to work, how this Prezi works. I'm going to talk in each video for about 5 to 7 minutes, maybe 10 minutes at the max if I can't rein myself in. And after I'm done, I'm going to say, meet me after the jump. And in between, there's going to be a little exercise with questions, either a text or a map or something for you to study and look at and to help you think and process the points that we're talking about. So the whole experience should take about 45 minutes, but each video will be about 5 to 7 minutes, and then each exercise between, you can take as long as you like. You can do it for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, or you can skip through it and do it in a couple minutes and come back to it later. But that's how this whole thing is going to work, and hopefully it will be useful for you. And just so you know maybe how it might be useful for you if you teach world history or AP World History, this lecture should speak to units 1 and 2 of the AP World History exam. I think that counts for something like maybe 15 to 20% of the exam questions. And this is really speaking about developments within the Dar al-Islam, the kind of global tapestry of the 1200s to 1500s, and the world, the kind of networks of exchange, but also the cultural consequences of that exchange, especially in the old world, and the way in which Islamic networks and Islamic trade routes connected the world all the way from Andalusia, southern Spain, North Africa, to the South China Sea. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Now, maybe just to tell you a little bit about the origin of this book project that I'm working on, called Prophet and Prophecy, Islam and the Spice Trade. And the seed of the idea came from my first book, which was called Said the Prophet of God, Hadith Commentary Across a Millennium. And this book really looked at the intellectual tradition of commentators on traditions attributed to Muhammad. And I tracked the evolution of that tradition from North Africa to Egypt to India. And I looked at the way in which these kinds of connected networks of intellectual exchange, not only across space, but also across time. And as I was working on that project, maybe the most famous commentator on these prophetic traditions, which are called Hadith, is a figure named Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. And he wrote one of these encyclopedic commentaries, 12 volumes on every word, every aspect of each hadith. He wrote about thousands of these hadith. It took him 30 years. It was his life project. He also happened to be the most powerful judge in the Mamluk Sultanate, which was based in Cairo. And what I learned about him when I started studying his biography was that actually when he died, he left something like 55 camel loads of pepper to be sold at his storefront in Alexandria, which would have been sold to these European merchants, these Italian merchants, mostly Venetians, but also Genovese and Pisans. And he would liquidate these 55 camelloads of pepper and have them not only settle up his debts and distribute it in his inheritance, but also to donate generous patronage to his students of Hadith. And some of these are the kind of luminaries of the Islamic scholarly tradition. So if you really want evidence that the kind of demand for spices in Europe were actually funding some of the luminaries of Islamic scholarship in Egypt and in the Arabian Peninsula, this is about as good as evidence as you will find. And it really got me thinking about the way in which the worlds of trade and business and economics were tied up and connected with these worlds of Islamic learning and Islamic norms and Islamic law. So that's the idea for the book project, and we're going to be exploring that in our lecture today. So for the first assignment, what I'm going to do is show you a number of maps, and for our first activity, our interactive activity, I want you to kind of study these maps, look at the way in which these networks of exchange change over time, and without talking too much, maybe try to come up with some hypotheses about why we see networks of exchange change or stay the same, thinking about political reasons, religious reasons, military reasons, and so forth. So just so you can see these maps, this is one of the most famous maps. This is from Janet Abou-Lubaud's famous book, Before European Hegemony, which is one of the books that really laid the groundwork for this new project I'm working on. And this is a famous map, and maybe you've seen it in other places, and she shows the way these kinds of regional networks were connected with one another. So most people didn't travel the whole world. I mean, Ibn Battuta and Marco Polo, these were figures that were the exception rather than the rule. And most people would travel kind of either across the Mediterranean, across the Red Sea, or they would just travel across the Arabian Sea or across the Bay of Bengal or across the South China Sea to the Straits of Malacca. And this is what I want to show you with this map. And I've highlighted in red the kind of maritime spice route that I'm describing here. And when I say the spice trade, I don't mean just spices and just pepper, but I mean similar to the way people use the Silk Road to talk about trade that goes beyond just of silk. It could be luxury items, but also these bulk items like cotton, timber and raw materials and things of that nature. But I think maybe what's misleading about this map is not only that it needs to be updated since it was first published in the late 80s, but also that it appears to be static. It's a kind of a snapshot in time. And what I've prepared for you are 3 maps from another article, and you can get the citation from the Prezi. It's actually in the image that you'll study. And it shows the way in which these trade routes change from the 11th to 13th centuries, the 13th and 14th centuries, and then how it changed again in the 15th century. So study these 3 maps and then try to answer the questions that I supplied after, and you can meet me after the jump. Hi there. I hope that interactive exercise was useful for you. We've now arrived at the first prong of my argument for the presentation today, which is trying to think of Islam not just spreading along with the spice trade in this kind of diffuse sense, like a byproduct of the trade, but really thinking about Islam as a commodity itself that's being traded across seas, across the Mediterranean, across the Red Sea, and across the Indian Ocean to the Straits of Malacca and the South China Sea. So the example that first comes to mind in thinking about trading Islam as a commodity takes us back to that figure Ibn Hajar that I talked about in the first video. His work, that encyclopedic work that I was telling you about, that he spent his whole life on, that book was commissioned by figures from North Africa and Central Asia. There was demand for that book in India. And we can actually track the way in which that book made its way from Cairo, across the Red Sea to Yemen, and then from there into Western India, into Gujarat. And not only tracking the movement of the book, but also its price and its value to collectors. And the kind of example that I always think about is this, there was this Gujarati Sultan in India who acquired that book in exchange for the land revenues from the district of Bharuch, which was a very wealthy district in Gujarat at the time. And so essentially, not just putting a kind of a figure like 1,500 dinars or something like that on the price of the book, but actually offering these kind of continuous land revenues, kind of taxes, so to speak, in exchange for this work of Islamic knowledge. So that's kind of one example. So thinking about the way in which books moved, but also the way in which scholars were acquired. So the way in which sultans from India would acquire, say, one of Ibn Hajar's students to kind of add one of Ibn Hajar's students to his court, and the kind of prestige that he would get from having from having someone who was learned in Islamic law and these traditions attributed to Muhammad as part of his court. We also know from the work of Elizabeth Lambourne that there were sultans in Yemen who would pay to have or give their patronage to preachers in India to read their name during the Friday sermons. So there are all these ways in which political rulers across these various, across long distances of space, are connecting wealth and business, but also religious authority through texts and through the movement of scholars. So so that's one example, and scholars could expect really wealthy, sometimes wealthy stipends, not only paid monetarily, but also in gifts of food, gifts of clothing, teaching appointments that carried prestige, judgeships, and so on. So the exercise that we're going to do next, the kind of interactive exercise that I want you to look at, is a text actually from Malacca. It's from John Leyden's translation of the Malay Annals, and describes a scholar and the way in which a scholar came, who was kind of trained in the Islamic tradition as it had been formed in the Arabian Peninsula, and the way in which that knowledge was being transmitted in exchange for gifts. And I want you to really try to think about, and maybe you can think about how you get your students to think about the way in which knowledge is exchanged, not just for money, but other kinds of gifts and social status. So with that having been said, take a look at that exercise and meet me after the jump.
Hi again. I hope that interactive exercise and that set of questions was generative and thought provoking for you. We just talked about how Islam itself was a commodity or an object of trade along these maritime routes, and now we're going to talk about the flip side of that coin. Um, Rather than thinking about how the spice trade spread Islam, we're going to think about the way in which Islam itself may have spread the spice trade. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean is that the practice of trade itself was dependent on certain forms of Islamic knowledge. And here I don't just mean navigational knowledge or, say, knowledge of astronomy so that you can navigate your vessel in the open seas, um, or knowledge of finance and accounting. So, thinking about advances in mathematics that allowed more precise or sophisticated financial reckoning, but actually thinking about the way in which, say, um, uh, knowledge of Islamic medicine, which contained knowledge of what we call medica materia, or spices themselves, the kind of pharmaceutical value of certain kinds of spices, how they interacted with the humors of the body, um, what religious benefits spices might have. That, in a sense, the knowledge of spices actually enhanced the value of that commodity itself, and or not even enhanced it, but in a sense was necessary for for using or appreciating uh, certain commodities, and I think spices are the example par excellence, particularly because of the sheer volume of them. The meaning of spices in Italian is spezies. It kind of derives from this idea of variety, multiple species, and not just the sheer kinds of spices: nutmeg, cinnamon, pepper, camphor, um, aloe wood, sandalwood, myrrh, different kinds of aromatics like frankincense. But within each of those commodities, there were different grades, different regions. That if you got aloe wood from India rather than China, they would be ranked and graded differently. There were certain regions of Indonesia and Sumatra that were famous for camphor, and other regions that would produce camphor of a lesser quality. So part of it is about part of the issue is about having the kind of knowledge that would help you distinguish between different grades and quality, and part of it is just understanding the properties, the kind of medicinal or pharmaceutical properties of the spices themselves. And this really underlines the point, today we think about spices as being those things that you get in a supermarket, just as a condiment to make your meals more flavorful. But in the era of the spice trade, spices were like drugs or the pharmaceuticals of the time, and that's why so much money is tied up in them, and also why so much expertise and knowledge is also required, and is also transmitted alongside them. So one example that I've been studying for this book project is actually the story of a Venetian physician, who also was a businessman and a merchant, who traveled from Venice to Damascus in the 15th century and actually studied Islamic medicine and tried to learn all he could about pharmaceuticals in the Islamic world by studying with a sheikh in Damascus. And when he was finished living in Damascus and he went back to Venice, he actually corrected and updated the major medical textbook that was in use throughout Italy and in Western Europe at that time. And he corrected it by studying the original manuscripts in Arabic. And this figure's name is Andrea Alpago, or sometimes you see it in the Latin, the kind of Latin surname of Alpagus. And he, he himself kind of as a figure similar to Ibn Hajar in the sense that he was both a scholar and a merchant. We know of his business holdings. We know at one point in his life he was even accused of defrauding the Venetians on in the way he calculated his taxes on his merchandise. He was cleared of this charge, but I think it indicates how embedded he was both in the economic and mercantile life of the spice trade, while also studying and transmitting Islamic knowledge on spices and medica materia and those kinds of things. So what kind of work would he have studied? He would have studied a work like this by Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah. He actually, we know he actually studied a commentary on Avicenna that was very famous. There were different traditions of Islamic medicine. A book like this looked more closely at the hadith reports, those traditions attributed to Muhammad that spoke about spices and talked about their properties and values. But even a book like this, which is much more religiously oriented, also drew heavily on the Greek medical tradition. Figures like Galen and Hippocrates are frequently cited in a book like this. So even in these kinds of texts, we see connections across space and intellectual traditions. As a figure like Alpago is coming from Venice, living in Damascus, studying work like this, he's also seeing the way in which the Greek tradition and the Islamic tradition is intertwined, just in a text like this. So part of my point that I just want to underline here is that the spice trade wasn't just an exchange of raw commodities like spices. It was also an exchange of all of the intellectual apparatus that supported and enhanced and explained the value of commodities like that. And in the interactive exercise, you'll see exactly how and why. The other aspect of this is the way in which the marketplace was regulated by Islamic religious authorities, and we see pharmacists and apothecaries and physicians and those who traded in spices were regulated according to Islamic norms and principles, or at least they were. There was an attempt to regulate the sale of spices according to certain Islamic norms and principles. And maybe this is where we're getting a little bit self-referential here, but in a sense, what is being demonstrated in an example like this is that trade, kind of Islamic norms about trade, are also being traded and exchanged. So, so in a sense, it's not just about knowledge of that facilitates trade, like navigational knowledge, and it's not just about knowledge of the commodities themselves that's being transmitted, such as what the kinds of things Alpago would have studied, the Islamic medicine, but also knowledge of trade itself and how best to regulate it, and what constitutes fraud, and what constitutes moral trade, or what constitutes what we would today call a moral economy. And I think, that's something that many students can understand today, as we talk about the ethics of globalization and all of the kind of moral issues and dilemmas that come up as we think about global trade today, the exploitation of workers, trading across national boundaries, the issue of tariffs, the issue of taxation, um, the kind of the issues of human trafficking, smuggling, the kind of theft of intellectual property. All of these are matters that are taken up in the world of the kind of medieval global economy, so to speak. And we see very clearly in the Islamic sources the way in which the moral boundaries of trade and the way in which they're regulated, not only by law but also by ethics. And I think you're going to see that very clearly in the interactive that I have planned for you next. So, just like we did before, meet me after the jump. Hi, so I hope that last pair of readings and set of questions was thought-provoking for you and useful, and helped you think a little bit about how you might dig deeper into this issue with your students. I just wanted to close with some concluding remarks, talk about some frequently asked questions and misconceptions, and then point you guys to some further reading.
So to sum up what I tried to do with this presentation today and the interactives was to try to get you to think about, what it actually means to say that Islam was spread by the spice trade, that kind of axiomatic thing that we tend to think about. And also to consider the reverse, what it might mean to say that the spice trade was spread by Islam. And what I really tried to show was that that as much as we try to compartmentalize economic exchange and the exchange of certain commodities like spices from all of the intellectual traditions and the kind of the moral landscape that shapes the boundaries of trade, you really can't separate them. And some of the biggest works in the field that have written about Islamic history and its relationship to world history, I think have really shown the way in which Islam really dominated the known world of trade before the rise of Europe in the modern age, and connected, this old world from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And if you want to think of an intellectual force that shaped the ethics of global trade prior to the rise of modernity in Western Europe, I think you really have to take seriously the Islamic tradition, and not just traders who happen to be Muslim, but really reckon with the idea of kind of Islam as a global intellectual force. And that's what I hope that I helped shed some light on today. And the way in which Islam itself was not only consumed along other spice trade objects, but also helped regulate that consumption and regulated the kind of set the kind of the scene, the moral landscape in which trade and consumption and exchange happened. So with that having been said, let's talk about some common misconceptions and some frequently asked questions. So the big one that you sometimes get from students is just the idea that there was no global trade before modern capitalism as we know it, and you can of course date it at different points, and you can say that it kind of arose in Italy in the 1300s, or you can argue that it was more it happened more with the kind of the coming of the Portuguese and the Dutch in the 15th century, or you can argue it happened much later in the 19th century. That's when that kind of great divergence happened. But any way that you slice this narrative, you have to come to terms with the fact that there was a very robust global trading network, and global in the sense that it really did stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific and connected connected peoples and communities and networks of traders across very long distances. And I think that's a really important takeaway point. Other kinds of common misconceptions we can talk about in the Q&A if you have heard questions from students that you think deserve a quick answer. In terms of further reading, a lot of the examples and books and texts that I brought up today, they are maybe a little less well known, maybe a little more obscure, and I think I really appreciate you indulging me with that. I think that's part of the point of the Summer Institute, is to kind of help expose you guys to some less well known figures and their books, but I will point you to a couple more well-known texts. One is the Travels of Ibn Battuta. This is a very accessible book that tracks the travels of an Islamic judge from the 1300s who traveled all the way from North Africa to China and back. And you really get all of these vivid and evocative details about his time in the Maldives and in India. And you get a sense, of course, of his time that he spent in Cairo and in Syria, and you even get a picture of China. And in a way, this book is even more magnificent and a more extraordinary accomplishment, arguably, than Marco Polo's travels. So this is a book to check out. Another really useful book would be this primary source reader called Islam in the Indian Ocean World. And of course, it collects Ibn Battuta and has some short excerpts from him, but it also has letters. It has from disparate figures, Muslims writing in China, writing in Indonesia, in India, in Yemen, and in Egypt as well. So this could be really useful resource for you. And I also included a list of online resources that my research assistant, whose name is Alyssa Bivens, she's a PhD candidate at George Washington in the history department. She collected this great list of online resources that includes online maps, medieval maps, other kinds of texts and translations, things that I think would be especially useful in the COVID-19 era, when it's hard to go to a physical library. And I really hope that that list will be useful for you as well. I may have adapted and tweaked it a little bit, and I hope it will prove useful for you and for your students. So thank you so much for your time and attention. I really look forward to talking to you guys on August, in August during the synchronous session. So thank you very much.
I found with such interest your description of the spice trade as they were the drugs of the time. And along with the drug trade, of course, even today is money, politics, the mechanics of trading. And you know, when I think of spices, I don't think of pharmaceutical products, and that was new to me. And as you described, that spices were pharmaceutical products like opium, and I don't know what else, but that was interesting to me. Also was of interest were that if someone knew about the Islamic regulation of trades in the marketplace, then that someone could go anywhere in the world and trade in an Islamic marketplace. So that access to and knowledge of the way Islam does business allowed that one person to go all over the world in major cities. So I don't know if there's a question there, but all of that enlightened me. And as you said, Islam was a commodity exported along with spice. Islam carried spice and spice carried Islam. But of course, that's much more nuanced. It's much more complex than that. And I very much appreciate the way you tried to teach that to us. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that, Jean. I think as scholars, we get really wrapped up in the details, especially when you're working on a long book project. But at the end of the day, the book only matters what people take away from it.
Mhm.
And the fact that you were able to take away those three really key points, I think, that's very gratifying.
Mhm.
I think just to underscore this idea of spice and broadening this category of what we think of as spice, I think most people think of it as the condiments that you buy at the grocery store now, the kind of McCormick brand. And actually, there's still a contemporary interesting politics of spice. Apparently, vanilla from Madagascar is there's a quite contentious politics and violence behind this kind of deep civil strife behind the manufacture of the vanilla bean. And I think, you know, there is a kind of a way of thinking about food history with spice, which is normally how we think of it. One book I'll really recommend is a book by Paul Friedman called Out of the East. And it's about the spice trade in the medieval European imagination. And that book does a good job of breaking down spice, different dimensions of spice. Spice as drugs, spice as a global commodity, spice as a food, as a condiment, spice as a sacred, you know, like incense and aromatics. And so that's a very good book for helping to open up new dimensions of thinking about spices. But I think maybe if I could just add one thing on this idea of the kind of spice as a pharmaceutical, you really needed knowledge of all of the various properties of each of these kind of various commodities like camphor or aloe wood or sandalwood or different kinds of frankincenses. And it's not apparent to the consumer what it is that these very this kind of immense variety of goods, what value they had. And for that reason, knowledge really is so connected with the history of the spice trade and the exchange of knowledge. And I think it's worth underscoring that it wasn't just a kind of what we think of as medicinal knowledge, a kind of secularized medicinal knowledge, but it was a knowledge that was happening within Islamic discourses. And there was even a genre of medicine called prophetic medicine, where Muslim scholars would write about what, not just what Muhammad had said about the property of a certain spice, but the long tradition of Muslim scholars that had either experimented with a spice or made different observations or had, through text learning, came up with something interesting or important about the value of that spice. So in that way, even more so, it wasn't just that knowledge and spice went hand in hand, but that Islamic knowledge was also inflecting or interplaying or at work with the trade of spices.
I have a really quick question, Joel. Aloe wood, is that referring to the aromatic wood from the Indonesian islands that is rotted by a fungus and acquires its amazing scent from that?
I believe so. I mean, some of the terms, you know, refer to, they maybe use the same word. This is where you need such technical knowledge of what certain terms would refer to in certain contexts. They might mean a certain kind of spice from one region rather than another. And I think that's what I loved so much about that reading that I included in my Prezi, is that they talked about the different kinds of aloe woods, if it had come from this region in China versus this region in Indonesia. It was of considered of a higher quality, and I think, or had greater potency. So some of the knowledge was just about the potency of the spice itself, but other aspects of the knowledge actually had to do with the value of it, and of course also sussing out frauds, because there's reams and reams of pages on how it was that people concocted and fabricated their own fake camphor or fake incense or fake how they could pass off fake spices. So this was also something that market supervisors needed to know.
Okay, great, thank you. We have a series of questions. We have Lucia Minervini.
Hi. Thank you for your work. I was sort of tripped up regarding your use of the word encyclopedia, and you used it to talk about the hadith. And I was confused because, and you know, I'm not a scholar here in this area or in Islamic tradition or anything, but I understood the hadith as thoughts of the prophet, correct? And then, so I forget the scholar that you mentioned, but he then had sort of longer meditations on those hadith, and then you characterized his meditations as a sort of encyclopedia of knowledge that was being passed. And, you know, when I hear encyclopedia, I teach AP European history. So I'm like Diderot, scientific revolution. So that idea of having an encyclopedia of meditations on the words of the prophet was sort of mind-blowing to me. And I was wondering if you could expand on that, because I only, you know, and also one other thing is that if someone could enlighten me as to the depth of scientific reflection and like observation of the natural worlds that actually goes on in the Quran, because I have not read the Quran. However, I have a lot of, you know, I lived in Saudi Arabia for 5 years. I've taught a lot of Islamic kids, and they're like, oh, the Quran is full of scientific evidence and theories and such. So I was wondering if you could just expand on those 2 points.
Sure. So maybe just starting from your last, kind of the idea of kind of Islam and science as being kind of pit against one another, I think is a common assumption that you hear today, or the idea that they kind of go hand in hand. And of course, I think we know from experience the truth lies somewhere in the middle. There is, I think, some really productive and generative dialogue between scientific traditions, Islamic sciences, Islamic religious sciences, but also, Muslim scholars who pursued mathematics and astronomy and medicine. And I think there is a lot of really productive overlap there. In terms of thinking about encyclopedias, very quickly, I will recommend that you take a look at a great book that was just published by my colleague, who's a professor at Brown University, named Ilyas Muhanna. And he published a book actually out with Penguin Classics. So I think you could get it for probably $18 or $19. It's a translation of Nuwairi's The Ultimate Art, the Height of Ambition and the Ultimate Arts of Erudition. It has one of these great titles, and he abridged a medieval Islamic encyclopedia that covers natural history, interpretation of the Quran, the creation of the world, contemporary history. And he abridged this 30-volume book into basically a little short, brief Penguin Classics book. And so if you want to get a taste of how important encyclopedia making was to Islamic culture during this period, his book is a great place to start. And I should say, in this period between 1300 and 1500, now there's this understanding that this was a kind of age of encyclopedia making in the Islamic world. And it didn't just affect how it was that people composed encyclopedias on the natural world, but the kind of, what I was describing in my lecture was a kind of encyclopedic style, meaning for a hadith that may be 2 lines long, you may see a kind of pages and pages of interpretation on every single word, every preposition, every the heading of the hadith, every the names included in the hadith, and just a kind of encyclopedic style. And I've referred to it also as kind of like a Rococo style, or a kind of Baroque style. If it were a kind of architecture, knowledge itself had this really detailed and elaborate aesthetic to it. It wasn't kind of simplified down. And I think the argument partly has to do with patronage networks, you know, the fact that you could support someone to be a full-time scholar, that they could spend their life doing it. But maybe we could argue actually the spice trade had something to do with it, because there were scholars like Ibn Hajar, who I mentioned in my lecture, who when they died liquidated their pepper holdings, sold them off to European traders, Venetians and Pisans and Genovese at the port in Alexandria, and then turned around and donated their money to their students, who were also hadith scholars. So there was a way in which the revenue that Muslim scholars who were also merchants on the spice trade, the revenue that they were getting from European demand for spice was actually fueling and supporting scholars who would write about hadith, in addition to other matters of law and theology and medicine and astronomy and mathematics and those kinds of things.
Okay, thank you. Jessica?
Hi. You talked in your video about how, you know, it wasn't just the commodities that were traded, but the knowledge that was communicated, and also the methods of trade that were transmitted across different places in the globe. And you mentioned, you know, that there was a lot of thought to the morality of different ways of engaging in trade. And I was wondering if you could talk more about that and how those values did or didn't contribute to capitalism as it emerged.
Boy, that is a great, I mean, I hope at the end of my writing this book, I have the perfect answer to that, because that ultimately, I think, is what people want to know, is how is it that this global economy that we're talking about, that one in which there's a kind of Muslim hegemony, or a Muslim kind of Muslims are both connecting and regulating the boundaries of this global economy. How is it that ultimately, what influence did that have on the globalization today? And sometimes what you'll see in the literature, scholars will make an argument that in a sense, we couldn't have had the kind of the rise of Europe, the ascendance of Europe, the growth of modern globalization, if there hadn't been this world system, or this global economy that had been dominated by Muslim merchants from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, and that Europe, in a sense, drafted off of that. There's other, you know, you'll see other arguments where scholars will actually point to specific devices, financial devices like the partnership agreement or a commenda contract, which allowed investors to share risk. And whereas before, an agent or an entrepreneur who would take on all of the risk if they borrowed from a lender, in Europe, they noticed that Muslims were trading by these partnership agreements, and they could actually share reward but also share losses. So if you had a shipwreck, you wouldn't lose everything. So they've pointed to those kinds of things. On the other hand, there are also really important discontinuities and ruptures. And a scholar named Olivia Constable, who published a book, I think it's called,
One of hers is Welcoming the Stranger.
Welcoming the Stranger. Yeah, is it hosting a stranger, welcoming this? There's something about
Welcoming the Stranger.
welcoming
Yeah,
the
something
stranger.
like that. Anyway, it's got stranger, and I'll look it
So
up.
yeah, so that Olivia Remy Constable, and there she argued actually that these what looks like almost colonies, Muslim kind of colonies across these port cities that stretch from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean to Southeast China, that they actually were, in a sense, she wondered, were these the predecessors to the colonies that we saw arise in Western Europe? Those kinds of colonization practices, and there she argues there was a really big rupture, that the kind of dynamics, the way in which foreign merchants were expected to abide by certain rules and regulations, that they had to be managed in certain spaces, that they didn't have the kind of violence, economic violence, but also physical violence that you see with the rise of colonization from Western powers was really broke all of these kinds of norms, social norms and boundaries that you had weren't perfectly maintained during the period that I'm talking about, but were kind of had been maintained or attempted to have been maintained, and were part of what constructed this the ethics of this global economy in the Middle Ages. So so I think there are good arguments for pointing to both continuities between this global economy in the late medieval and this global Renaissance, so to speak, but also really important discontinuities. And I think if you can try to convey that complexity to your students, I think that would be really important, because there's neither a straight line nor just a straight rupture. And maybe getting your students to just engage what are some of the continuities between the globalization of this period and our own kind of modern capitalism, and what are the differences.
Right. Several of us put the book in the chat. It's called Housing the Stranger, and one of the things she speaks about is the very fact of having institutions for housing the stranger, as opposed to expelling them and not allowing people, say, of different faiths to trade, as prevailed in some places in Europe, many places in Europe. So her book is really fascinating. She unfortunately passed away at quite a young age, Olivia Remy Constable. The next question we have is from Melissa Cohen-Nichols.
Hi, thank you again for the lecture. It was very interesting. And I was wondering, we always try to bring things up to the modern world today. So I was wondering if the information from this medical knowledge, is it still being utilized in modern medicine? Or is it being reevaluated now at any time? Because it seems like a lot of this was probably the basis for modern medicine, but maybe to give my students examples of things, how this is being used today, if it's still in.
So thank you, Melissa, for that question. Recently, I was thinking about this for when my wife was pregnant with my daughter. We were looking up anything you could do for morning sickness. And if you go onto any kind of medical health websites, there are like maybe a few possible things that you can do, but usually what people suggest are ginger, essential oils from ginger and lemon. Those are like the two biggest things you can do, either sniff a lemon, sniff ginger, or get essential oils or anything like that. And sure enough, I had been studying this 15th century Yemeni manuscript that was a travel regimen to traveling merchants and scholars. What can they do to avoid nausea while they're on their ships? And of course, what they recommend are quinces, which are, I guess, a kind of citrus. So there are these kinds of connections that you see where, and of course, lemon and ginger, these would be things that you would typically see in Islamic medical textbooks like Avicenna's major medical textbook. So I think that there are areas where you still see some connection today. I think Avicenna's medical textbook was taught as recently as the early 1700s in Spain. That was the last time it was actually assigned at a medical school in Europe. So people had, for the longest time, this medical textbook by Avicenna it may have been the most read textbook in the world. It was read in Europe, it was read in Southeast Asia, it was read in India. We have commentaries in Sanskrit, we have commentaries in Latin. This book was a book that people were reading in China, and it was being taught, it crossed boundaries of faith, ethnicity, language. This was really a powerful textbook, and it was called The Canon by Avicenna. And you can still find some things in there today that you would see holistic, more holistic doctors or physicians or nurses recommending.
Yeah, one of the works in the literature sampler that I just shared with you is from Al-Razi, also a very famous Muslim physician of that period. And it's called Spiritual Healing, it's in translation. And he talks about getting the health detriment of getting angry and worrying. And it's a wonderful, very small work, but it's quite in tune with what we think of today. I have the next question from someone who's listed here as IREAM. I'm not sure what name that corresponds to.
Sorry, I think that's me. I'm Lauren. Hi, I just want to ask a question about, I wanted, it's kind of following what the last questioner was asking about. Can you give some specifics of spices that were demanded for medical uses?
So the one that I included in my Prezi was aloe wood, and I did that specifically because it was one of the few things that people thought they could do to ward off the plague. And it was
that was going to be my follow-up question. What ideas they had, and were they effective?
Yeah, so that, of course, they were not effective. Some people thought they were, and honestly, it was the only thing you could do. I mean, it's like, it's like anything. Today we can really relate to folks who were living in the time of the plague, because you can wear a cloth mask. Hopefully, it will do something, but then you find out,
you know, there's things like that that you hope are effective, and sometimes it does feel symbolic or like a more you know, it could be more of a status symbol, or kind of now masks, you know, we know that masks kind of signal your loyalty to a certain political persuasion too. So there's ways in which we could certainly see different kinds of spices and things like that intersect with politics and with class in this period as well. But aloe wood, sandalwood, these were incenses that were very commonly burned because people thought that the plague was actually pestilential air. And they thought that the plague was just in the air. And so if you were able to fumigate the air by burning incense, then you could try to clear it up. Mm-hmm. And but you know, actually some of the most vocal critics of those kinds of things were sometimes religious. I mean, it really, when these kinds of spices proved to be ineffective at saving people from the plague, then religious voices like Ibn Hajar, who I talked about there, said, what we need to do is, rather than turning to these kinds of you know, listening to, you know, quack physicians who don't know what they're talking about, we have to practice patience, we have to practice social care as a response to the transmission of the plague. And in a way there, you see, just by not recommending certain kinds of spices or concoctions or different kinds of cocktails, he's asking his readers to change their comportment, their behavior, their way of thinking, and their way of relating to society. So in that sense, even when medical knowledge had its limits in this period, it was still influential, because it meant that there was more space for other kinds of religious actors and other kinds of voices to be persuasive.
Okay, we have 3 questions, people's hands up, and I just want to quickly mention that one of Karima's contributions to the emergence of Renaissance in the second segment is the plague across cultures. That might be very relevant right now. In the meantime, we have Linda Burns has her hand up, and then Najla and Katie.
Hi, thank you so much. That your lecture was so applicable to a unit that I teach, and I was so excited to think more about those connections and the spread of sort of ideas along with products. And what really struck me was getting students to see that scholars were merchants. I'd never really thought to sort of see that connection, and I think that's really helpful, and also shows them that scholarship was really valuable, which I don't think they can, given the society we live in now, they don't necessarily see that. But actually my question was, in that unit, we really emphasize the idea that our goal in our unit is to get kids to question this claim that the West, you know, is this special place that had this wonderful culture that, right, the given sort of thing that we're trying to combat. And we emphasize this idea that the West was isolated and sort of backward, but the more I'm hearing what you talked about, and the more I'm hearing reading, I'm wondering if we're sort of overemphasizing that, and we should be instead talking more about the West as being, Europe as being really connected. They're not the area that everybody wants. They don't have all this stuff, but they are connected more. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that idea and sort of helping students see that connection.
Yeah, thank you, Linda, for that. I mean, I think seeing the way in which Europe, I mean, to think about the way it was, to think about the way in which it was connected. Yes, I think that you have to see Europeans as another actor on this global stage.
And you know, I was talking about this with my colleague who was writing a book manuscript that told the story of these Muslim scholars and Islamic legal scholars and how they spread out from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. And he just wanted to leave out Europe altogether. He said, enough of Europe, Europeans. There's plenty that what we really need to understand are these Islamic judges and lawyers and their texts. And of course, when the Dutch got to Southeast Asia, the first thing that they did was translate these works of Islamic law and author commentaries on them and interpret them. And so they translated these works into Dutch. They acquired many of the works that were written in Malay or in Javanese or in Balinese. And so much of our own perspective on Southeast Asia from this period comes from universities in Leiden and the earliest Dutch collectors, who some of them were merchants and scholars. Mm-hmm. So I think there is a way in which I think we do have to think about the nature of those connections. Of course, we shouldn't whitewash them or gloss over moments when there was brazen exploitation or violence. Of course, that was happening within the Islamic world as well, and I hope later you'll have a greater chance to talk about the slave trade too across the Indian Ocean during this period.
Indeed.
But it seems,
going on too long.
Sorry, I'm just going to follow up. So it seems like it's almost like Europeans they saw themselves as part of this global community, as opposed to sort of seeing themselves as isolated from it, right? Like, I think that's the other thing that is a misunderstanding that students have, like that.
So this figure that I'm writing about and I put in the Prezzi lecture was a doctor from Venice who went to Damascus to study the canon of Ibn Sina. And he studied this great medical textbook, and he found that actually the way the current edition of that textbook that had been taught in Europe for 200 or 300 years had all of these errors in them. So when he actually went back and corrected that textbook line by line after having studied the original text in Arabic, and then that was published during the 1500s. And I think that does show a little bit of the relationship, right? That I mean, it shows, I mean, Muslim scholars were not traveling to Venice to study medicine. It was Venetians who were coming to Damascus to study medicine. But on the other hand, this is a great example where you actually have a real connection between a Venetian doctor and a Muslim sheikh who is transmitting knowledge. So Europeans are audiences of these works. They're also translating them, they're reading them, they're analyzing and interpreting them. So I think isolation, or maybe even insulation, is a bit too, is maybe a bit too sharp of a term. And maybe we need some word between connected and insulated.
I like audience, actually. I wrote that down.
Right.
I think that's good. I like that.
Right.
Thanks.
We have Najla and then Katie, and we've already exceeded your time, but we're very glad to have you for another few minutes, Joel.
Oh, I'm having so much fun, and I'm learning
Okay.
so much from this, by the way. So I'm
Great.
really grateful for these questions.
Okay, Najla, Drubi.
That's a quick comment. I mean, regarding the person who asked about medicine being still used, Islamic medicines being still used. I work with Syrian refugees now that have come to the States. And the last 4 years, every time they go to the doctor and it doesn't work, they go back and revert to what they call Arabic medicine, which is really Islamic medicine, and that works for them. So it is still very much alive and used in many parts of the world. And when you look at homeopathic medicine or herbal medicines or whatever, where did it all come from? So yes, it is still very relevant. Now, in terms of the finances, and your comment about the colonization, that Islamic colonization was much gentler than Western colonization, has made me think, along with some stuff I read this morning in the book about how they treated women during the Renaissance. I mean, here we are constantly emphasizing how the West is much better than the East, but it looks to me like it's a reversal. The East, the Muslim world was doing much better and treating people better than the Western world is treating. So maybe this is something that we can emphasize also in classes. Stop looking as West versus East and stop looking at white versus Black. There's advantages to all sides. And the way we have been taught is basically what historians have written from the point of view of the white person. And I mean, let's make the parallels to help with the movement that is happening right now too, is my comment.
Right. And even the idea of Europe, as you'll see in the map, the section on cartography, people wouldn't have thought of themselves yet hardly as Europeans. This was just beginning to come into its own. They were from Venice or from, somewhere in France or Spain or a city. People were more attached, I think, to their local place. Is that not fair, Joel?
Yeah, I agree with you, Susan. And of course, whenever you talk about Europe, anyone who is in your audience who's from Eastern Europe or the Balkans, immediately says, I'm not part of, my part of Europe isn't being elevated or held up as supreme. And
it's nowhere in the curriculum. Eastern Europe is AWOL in the curriculum. It's just astonishing, actually.
Yeah, and I think the kind of East versus West or West versus East dichotomy, as much as we can, in my classrooms, I really try to, I know that's the thing that's on students' minds. So you want to address it, and part of you wants to address it head on. On the other hand, you don't ever want to be in a position where you say, oh, Islam, it was so much gentler, it's a form of colonialization, colonization was so much gentler. Then people will always raise exceptions, and there are really important exceptions where you see moments, as I said before. I mean, there was a very active slave trade in the Indian Ocean during this period, and you hear Muslim scholars themselves outraged, scandalized by what they see as abusive practices in the marketplace involving the trafficking of human beings and enslaved persons. So, it is, I think, as much as we can to try to really give students context, to try to provincialize or parochialize, and really think about what was going on in a certain moment in history. I think that will put us in a much better stead for having conversation. But of course, it still comes back to what your original question, Najla, and I think we should try to be frank and forthright, and not try to. So I'm often torn on exactly what the best way is to address that kind of big question.
Okay, thank you. We have time for one more question, which is Katie Scorza.
Hi, I am really interested in your sort of concluding statement that you made that you revisited today about we have to think about capitalism differently, and that the rise of Italy and Portugal is a divergence from this system, not something new. And so I'm thinking specifically about patronage, because at least my textbook uses the Medici as an exemplar when we get to the Renaissance. They say, okay, we have bankers and we have merchants, and now they have money and they can be patrons of the arts, and then now we have the Renaissance. So I'm thinking about your pepper merchant and the other sort of patrons that you mentioned in your lecture, and I'm just wondering, when I talk about them with my students, can I give these examples of patronage as the same kind of thing, or are they different? And if so, how? You know, how, if we are trying to bring the world of the European Renaissance in covering it better and its connections to other parts of the world, how different are the Medici from the models you've given us, or are they not at all?
That's a really cool question, a really cool comparative question, because normally the comparative question is East and West or Islam and Christianity, but here you're actually thinking about how did patronage practices, how do you compare them across these different regions and languages and religious traditions. I actually think it probably could be likened. I mean, I think there were really important big families and households in medieval Egypt and in medieval Syria. You see these, you see the same names of big merchant families. And Ibn Hajar himself was raised in the by the Harubi family, which was kind of a Medici family. I mean, they were so powerful, they bailed out the Sultan of Egypt when he was trying to fight a war to stave off the Timurids in the early 1400s. So there's this, there is a way in which there are these really big, powerful merchant families, and they're funding mosques. They are supporting scholars and scholarly networks. I mean, they're not patrons of the arts in the sense that you can't do oil paints in this context, but they are patrons of, say, manuscript making, and you often see books commissioned or collected by important families and political officials too. So I really like to think about, I guess the way I think about patronage, though, in this case, is it's not only that the patrons are, it's not just that the spice trade is giving them the revenue that they need to patronize Islamic arts or Islamic sciences or knowledge production more broadly, but that they're also carving out the pathways by which that knowledge flows, because they're creating port cities. They're creating connections across these ports. So they're also kind of creating demand for that knowledge, even as they're generating revenue to support it. And then of course I always like to think it gets circular at a certain point, because the knowledge that they are patronizing also shapes the marketplace, because Islam has so much to say about trading practices and travel, as Susan, I think, pointed out in the beginning. So it all, I mean, to really think about the connections between business and religion here, it does kind of take you in a loop. And I think it's important to not think about it as unidirectional, that there was business and then it funded the export of religion, or it funded religion, but to think about the way in which religion in turn changed and altered patronage networks. And then it kind of goes back and forth from there.
Okay, well, thank you so much. This has been really wonderful. And what we're going to do now, the best laid plans of mice and men, we were scheduled for a 5-minute break 5 minutes ago. And but it's so valuable to be with the scholars, and so I kind of let things go. But I would love for you to be able to get into breakout groups and take a look at the segment 1 of the Emergence of Renaissance. And if you like, also 2 other resources. One of them is the Indian Ocean and World History, which you saw. And there's another one called IslamicSpain.tv, which probably the best idea right now is if I were to put you into groups, and then if somebody needs to leave the room and take a quick break and come back and work with the group. We have 55 people in the room. And so I think I will make.
So just before you do that,
yes.
I just want to thank everyone. Thank you so much.